Question: as a developer, are you able to whip up a user interface that's halfway decent? Because sometimes that's a really useful skill to have. Today I'm going to show you how to go from this to this. I'm going to share 7 UX design tips with you that will massively improve the user interfaces you build, even if you're working with a UX designer. Let's dive in. If you're new here, you want to become a better software developer, gain a deeper understanding of programming in general, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss anything. Your company may have a UX designer or perhaps even a whole team of them. But what happens if your UX designer is on a holiday? Or they forgot to design a part of the application you're working on and you loathe any kind of social interaction? Or what if your manager wants you to build a tool for internal use only and doesn't want to spend any money on design? Or you're the only employee in a startup and you just have to figure it all out yourself? In short, unless you're working on deep backend stuff or DevOps only, knowing a bit of UX design as a software developer is really useful. This video is not so much about writing code, though the code I'll be working on is available in a Git repository. The link is in the description. I'm going to take you through an example application and improve the user interface using 7 UX design tips. I'll be using TypeScript, React and Material UI, but these tips apply to any kind of programming language or UI framework. You can apply them immediately to the user interfaces you're working on. This is not a complete list of UX design tips and principles. They come from my own personal experience developing products with complex user interfaces. And each of these things have made a huge improvement in the quality of my work. So grab a coffee, some snacks and a notebook. And make sure to watch this video till the end to get the most out of it. My first tip is a general one. Save yourself a bunch of time by relying on a design system. It doesn't matter which system you choose. Google has Material Design, there's Bootstrap by Twitter, and there are others. These design systems are built on decades of user interface research, and because of that they provide a great starting point to develop something that looks at least decent. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. This user interface, which uses Material Design, doesn't look half bad, even though it has severe usability issues. And that also highlights a limitation to design systems. They don't solve everything, and that's where my other tips come in. Let's take a look at the example. So today's example is an internal tool for a company. Let's call that company ArjanCodes. It has a sales section, a marketing section, a finance section, and an admin section. Of course, we're most interested in the admin part of this. So let's click on that and then we get this page. And this is basically a placeholder page where we can add or remove some users. We can send policy information about holidays, salary, printing, those kind of stuff to our users. We have a menu to export or import some data, and we can go back to the home page here. And to the left of this page, we have a menu with a couple of options, like we can look at security issues in the system, there are notifications, and there is an option to upgrade this whole system to a premium version. I didn't implement all these things, obviously, it's just meant as an example to discuss the design aspects of this. The code is written in TypeScript and uses React. So we have an admin component that has a left drawer, it has some titles and texts, and it has this policy settings part and the user table part. And these are all separate components that I also put here in the code. It's not really important that this is TypeScript and React. You can basically apply these tips and ideas that I'm going to talk about to any type of code that you're working on. So the second tip I want to give you is that you should make the flow of your application natural. What do I mean by that? Let's look at this page. And this is actually a tip that mainly goes back to how your users navigate through your application. In this case, we see we have this area on the left, which is mainly used for navigation between different sub-pages within this admin environment. And we have the home, which is kind of the overview of the different parts of the application. Now, the thing is that often users view the way that they go through an application as going from left to right. So here I'm going basically to the right. And from a user perspective, this page in terms of navigation is actually pretty confusing. On the left, you have these sub-pages. If you want to go back, which to the user feels like going to the left, you have to go click on this button that's on the right side of the screen. Sending policy info is something that a user feels like is, okay, I'm doing something, I'm continuing, I'm moving to the right, but this is actually on the left. So that feels very confusing. Overall, you want to give your users the feeling that they're moving from left to right and back again in your application. So when we start, we're on the left, then we move into the application to admin, Then we're going to add users. Then we say cancel, we go back to the left, etc., etc. And you want your user interface to reflect that idea, to make it coherent to the user. So in this case, what we can do to make this better is actually move this back to home button to the left side, because we're going back to the left. And the same idea, by the way, applies to if you have like a pagination, like previous, next, you want to put the previous button on the left and the next button on the right. So let's change the code and move this home button to the left and the send policy info button to the right. And you see it's already going to make a big difference. And now, of course, here on the left, we don't have a lot of space. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move this button into this menu. So let me switch back to the home page. So here we have the menu on the right, and that's actually a material UI list. So let's add another item to this list that actually takes us back to home. I'm going to add here another list item. This is called home. And when I click on this, let's add a function here to handle going home. And we're going to need the router for this. That's how we go home. Let's see what this looks like. So now we have this home button here. Let's clean that up a little bit. We're going to add an icon. And let's make this text boldface to separate it a bit from the rest of the menu. And so then this is what you get. We can separate it visually even a bit more. For example, you could add a divider. And we could actually make this boldface. And then this is what we get. I can click here and I go back home. So this feels much more natural. And now we can obviously also remove that button. So let's also do that. So that's this button here. And then this is already looking a lot cleaner. Next step is moving this button to the right. So here's that button. Let's add a text align style here. Like so. And let's see what it looks like. So now this is what we get. So already looks a little bit cleaner and the navigation feels more natural in this way. The third tip is that colors have a meaning. You need to make sure in your interface that if you use a color that you're always using it in the same way. And that's actually an issue here where we have an add users button that's orange and we have a send policy info button that's yellow. There's no particular reason why this button should be yellow. In fact, if you look at the rest of the interface, you see that all the other things, if they're clickable, they are orange. So in order to make the interface more consistent, we should also make this button orange. So let's change the color. And then this is what that looks like. So this is also a bit cleaner. Generally, when you design these kind of interfaces, you often have a kind of primary color that you will use for anything that's interactive, anything that's clickable. And then you'll have a number of accent colors. So you could, for example, use the yellow color as an accent color in another place. For example, what you could do is give this manage your users message here an accent color so that it jumps out a bit more. So for that, I'm going back to this level. So here we have this message. So what you can do is give this a background color that's actually an accent color. Now you get this. This looks pretty ugly. Let's add some padding. Now this is already a bit better. I think the color is a bit strong. We could add some opacity to this. To add a bit of opacity, I'm going to use the color package that I'll import here. And with the color package, you can parse existing colors, apply alpha values to them, convert them back to string, convert them to different formats, and so on. So that's pretty useful. So let's create a color object, give it an alpha value, and then convert it to a string. So now we get something that looks a bit better. And then let's add a little icon in front of the message. And then this is what that looks like. So what we've achieved now is make sure that anything that's orange is clickable. And the other colors are used mainly as accents in other areas of the interface. For example, here we're using it for the message, but also the header bar and the logo has accent colors. The fourth tip is that you should always have a single main action per screen. On this screen, it's not completely clear what you want your users to do. Do you want to send policy info? Do you want to add new users? If I click on the table, I get another button that also looks very similar to the other two. So the first thing we need to do to fix this is to define what the main action is on the screen. So let's assume that the main action is adding users. In that case, we need to change the style of these buttons to make them appear a bit less prominent. So let's do that. So I'm going back to my policy settings screen and I'm going to change the color of this send policy button here. So I'm just going to make it black. I'm going to remove the color here and I'm also going to change the variant and make it outlined. So let's see what that looks like. So then we get this, so that's really nice. The button is still there, but it's much less prominent. And I'm going to do the same thing to the send email button. So that's in the user table and that's here. So here I'm also going to remove the color and make it an outlined button. And then this is what we get. So now it's much clearer. This is the thing we want people to click on. It looks a bit weird that this button is now to the right and this button is to the left. I'm going to change that in a minute. So I have 3 more tips for you and then I also have a bonus. If you're enjoying this so far, give this video a like. The 5th tip is to always separate actions from navigation. In this case, if you look at this left menu, a couple of these items are navigation items. I'm navigating to home, I'm navigating to different sub-pages in this interface. Upgrade to premium is not navigation, that's an action. If you look at this menu, there are mainly actions. Sharing an invite code, importing or exporting user data. But there's also settings, which is actually navigation. This is very confusing because you never know if this is going to open a dialog or if you're going to go to a completely separate page or whatever. And it also doesn't make it really clear how the structure of your application is set up. If you simply look at this menu, we don't know that there is a settings screen, but actually it's hidden behind this menu. That's not a good idea. So there's a couple of things you can do to improve this. One thing you can do is increase consistency by moving all the navigation together in a single place. So for example, I can move this settings item here and put it in the navigation where it belongs. An advantage of this is that as a user, you always have an overview of what the structure is of your application. That's really nice. Another way to do it is that you can also change the style of things to make them appear more separately from navigation items. For example, this upgrade to premium action, maybe your marketing department doesn't want this to move to this action menu because they want users to upgrade to premium, so it should be prominently visible in the interface. What you can do in that case is change the visual style so that it's clear to the user that this is not navigation, but it's something else. So let's move settings over to the menu here and let's change the style of upgrade to premium to solve this. So first let's go into this basic menu. So here we have the settings menu item and I'm just going to remove this here. And I'm going to the left drawer and adding an extra menu item for settings in this place. And let's also import the settings icon. And now this is what we get. So we have all the navigation here. We moved settings from this menu, so this is also a bit cleaner. The only thing still left to do is update the style of upgrade to premium to something else. Let's turn this into a button so that it looks a bit more like this. And since this is already a button, this doesn't need to be a button anymore. Let's make it full width. and change it to have a primary color. And finally, let's also make it outlined. And then this is what it looks like. So now the nice thing is that it's really clear that this is something very different from this. So the navigation is nicely put together here. So putting an action like this in a navigation area here is not an issue. What I generally avoid is put navigation into a menu. So I don't put settings pages here and stuff like that, because they are then hidden for the user and the user doesn't know what the structure is of your application anymore. By putting settings navigation here, it's clear to the user that there is an area called settings where the user can change things. The sixth tip is that you should be really careful with dynamically adding and removing elements from your interface. It's generally better to disable things if they're not available. Look at this example. Whenever I select one or more users, I have this send email to users button. Obviously, if I don't select any users, I can't send an email because I didn't select anybody. So if I remove the selection here, you see the button disappears. For the user, this is actually very confusing, because when you click on things, suddenly buttons appear in the interface that were not there before, and that's generally a bad idea. So it's much better to disable this button when you didn't select any user. So let's change that as a first step. So that's something I should do in this part of the code. So here you can see I only display the button if there is a number of users that I selected from the table. So instead of this, I'm going to use that same value to switch on or off whether the button is disabled. So now you see when I haven't selected any of the users, the button is disabled. And let's also move this send email button to the left so that the add users is featured a bit more prominently. And then this is what we get. And then the final tip I have for you is that you can use space to better separate elements of your screen. In this case, actually it's not that bad, but it's not really clear what belongs to what. So in principle, we have three areas in this screen. We have the top part, which is the header and description. Then we have the policy sending part. And then we have a user table part with different actions. So what you can do is add a little bit of extra space to better separate these different elements for the user. And then this is what you get. Pretty minor change, but it adds a little bit of extra separation. But you can see that space actually helps here to show that this filter option here, because it's very close to the table, it belongs to the table. Similar for this send policy info button that belongs to this part, so it's very close together. Alright then, a bonus tip is to make sure that your user interface is smart and is actually aimed at making life better for the user and not making life better for the system. And here's a good example of where that goes wrong. So in this case, for the policy sending part, I can select the policy type. I can put in an email address and then I have the send policy info button that I can click. If I click this currently, there is no email address. So what happens is that I get this error. So what I did here is to make sure that there is not going to be some kind of crash or whatever if we try to send something to an empty email address. But that's looking at it from a system point of view. The user interface is not made for the system, it's for the user. So you should make it better for the user. So that means that for a user, it should always be perfectly clear what you should do. In this case, if I don't fill in an email address, I shouldn't be able to click on this button and get an error. The button should simply be disabled. So let's change that in the code. And this is actually pretty simple to solve. So I'm storing the email address that you're typing in this variable. So I'm simply disabling the button if that email address is empty. Like so. And now default, this thing is disabled. As soon as I start to type an email address, then it becomes enabled. You could obviously do better validation here and make sure that this is actually a valid email address before you enable this button, but I won't cover that in this video today. So in general, make your user interface smart and make it adapt to the user instead of the other way around. I've seen pretty bad cases of this, by the way. For example, I've seen interfaces where you had to press buttons in particular order for the system not to crash. So you first should press a button to read something from a file, then put in some parameters, then press a button to process some data, and then another button to export the file. And if you didn't do things in that exact order, the application would crash, and none of these buttons were smart. They were not disabled if some values were not provided, etc. So that's a really bad practice to do those kind of things. Always make sure that your interface works together with your user. And in fact, when you think about it, this is actually the most difficult part of getting a user interface right, because it requires you to really think about what your user wants to do, and you need to put yourself into the mindset of your user to understand how your user interacts with your application. It takes a lot of time and research to do this well, but in the end, the reward is also very high. So these tips have really helped me create better, more intuitive user interfaces, especially if those pesky UX designers are on a holiday again. Seems like they always are. If you like this, also check out this video, where I show you a nice visual effect called glass morphism that you can apply to your user interfaces and take them to the next level. The community on Discord has been growing, and there have been a couple of really nice discussions lately, so don't miss out and come join us there. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you in the next video.